Hi, I'm Rex Black, President of RBCS. Welcome to the RBCS YouTube channel. Hey, I hope you enjoy all these free resources that are available here. And do us one favor. We need to keep the lights on and we need your help to do that. So, when you need testing and quality related services, training, consulting, expert services, you name it, let us be one of the bidders on that next job. We don't expect to get all of your business, but we'd like to get a chance. Thanks and enjoy the shows.
I'm Rex Black, President of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, RBCS has delivered insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. Our team of international consultants deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I'm the author of 12 books on software testing, including the bestseller Managing the Testing Process and 4 books on the ISTQB program. RBCS is presenting this webinar in partnership with Software Test Professionals. Check out their website at www.softwaretestpro.com. And special mention, I was at their conference last week, STPCon in Denver. It was great. Saw some familiar faces there and met some new people. It was very nice. So I hope to see some of you at the upcoming STPCon in San Diego next year. Attendance at today's webinar earns PMI PDUs. I would like to thank Murali Guthula for reviewing the materials for PDU status and, as always, for making very valuable suggestions. Attendees will receive an email telling them how to claim the PDUs, including the PDU code. PDUs are available for live webinar attendance only. Before we start the presentation, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have any questions or comments during the course of the webinar, please feel free to submit them throughout the presentation via your webinar interface, but please note they are answered only at the end. There is no need to ask for presentation copies, though someone surely will, as the presentation is on the web at www.rbcs-us.com. Navigate to the Resources tab in the upper middle, and from there to the Basic Library, and you will find them. By attending this webinar, you were automatically registered for the free e-learning drawing. Check your email over the next couple days and watch that spam filter. I hope you enjoy this free webinar from RBCS. We do these free webinars as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. Okay, so today we will be looking at how to apply risk-based testing in Agile life cycles. Something a lot of our clients do is practice risk-based testing, but they often have problems when they've gone to Agile projects with continuing to do that because the order in which things happen gets a little bit modified. But it is actually primarily a sequencing issue, and you can get all of the benefits of risk-based testing throughout the entire test process, from planning and analysis all the way through to execution and results reporting. Just a matter of figuring out how to fit it in the right places in the process. So let me show you how to make this work. Okay, so in this graphic, let me get the spotlight up, and hopefully will work. Each iteration or sprint would be if you were following the Scrum approach, which a lot of our clients, I'd say most of our clients that are following Agile are following some variant of Scrum. So you got each iteration or sprint shown here, these kind of loopy looking things where the programmer writes code. Code ideally goes through a code review. It goes through a unit test, though sometimes the unit test would precede the code review or be even in parallel with the creation of the code if they're using something like test-driven development. And then there's a feature verification test using something like acceptance test-driven development or behavior-driven development, something to verify that the acceptance criteria are met. And then ultimately there is an acceptance test by the business stakeholder, usually some sort of demo or the business stakeholder sees it work and effectively validates the implementation of the user story being the Agile name for a requirement. And as the code is being built, it's constantly being integrated into the continuous integration framework. Most of our clients are using something like Hudson, or Jenkins, or something along those lines now. Now, the project consists of a sequence of these sprints. The project can basically end at any point. We might decide, okay, we've actually built enough now, we don't need to continue this, we can just deliver it to the customer now. Or some of our clients, they are delivering continuously, and some of our clients are actually doing a mix of delivering at the end of every sprint for some of their stuff, like their web-based stuff, and for other kind of enterprise applications, they go through a number of sprints before they actually push something out into production. So it kind of depends on how the organization wants to do that. Now, in terms of what risk-based testing does here in the life cycle is at the beginning of each sprint, you're going to do a quality risk analysis based on the content of that sprint. So as part of going through the user stories and cleaning up the user stories, refining the user stories for that sprint, prior to doing the estimation, which is something I'll get right back to, we're going to go and do a risk analysis on the content of the sprint, primarily based on the user stories, though it's important to remember that there are some non-functional risks that might be might transcend, as it were, the any one user story. Security and performance and reliability can be like this. That there are risks which are more systemic, more emergent from the entire system rather than associated with a single user story. So we're going to do that quality risk analysis during the sprint planning. Again, as part of going through the user stories prior to the estimation. And then after the estimation is done and we've decided on what actually is going to be the content of the user story, then we have to design and implement the test to cover the risks, which is typical. I mean, this happens in risk-based testing for traditional sequential lifecycle models as well. The thing that's a little different here is that we're going to need the developers to create the features in the order of risk to the extent that they can. Now, the reason for this is, remember that in risk-based testing, we want to run the higher risk tests first. Well, in a sequential lifecycle model, if we're talking about system tests, since you wait until you're feature complete before you start system test, I can run the tests in whatever order I want as a test manager, and it has nothing to do with the order in which the developers created them. In Agile, since I'm going to start my system testing of the user stories that have been implemented as soon as those are delivered to me in the sprint, then in order to run the tests in risk order, the user stories have to be built in risk order. Now, this isn't as disruptive as it might sound because, of course, the user stories are prioritized, or at least they should be. Best practice is that they would be. And priority is going to influence the order of implementation anyway. And priority is also going to have a strong impact on the impact rating in the risk-based testing analysis, from the quality risk analysis. So it's not a dramatic deviation that's being proposed here, but you do have to make sure that the developers are on board to build things in risk order. And then in terms of your automated tests in the continuous integration system, you have to look at risk again to go, okay, well, the level of regression risk associated with a particular item that's going to mean, that's going to influence how much regression testing I put, automated regression testing I put in the continuous integration framework. So again, there we'll be looking at risk, and one would assume that the depth of testing done by the product owner, other business stakeholder during their acceptance test would also be based on the level of risk. So that's what this looks like, graphically speaking. Testing, as in any life cycle model, it doesn't matter which, we're trying to determine what to test, in what order, and how much, based on the level of risk associated with various attributes of the system. And what this will do is maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of the testing effort with respect to minimizing the residual level of quality risk at the end of testing. I mean, any testing that you do will reduce the level of quality risk, reduce the risk of previously undetected failures in production. But only risk-based testing is actually designed to maximize the amount of risk mitigation that is achieved by testing. Any other technique that is not risk aware will leave a larger amount of residual risk behind. Now, if you're not familiar with risk-based testing at all, then one of the things I would recommend is that you go to the RBCS website, rbcs-us.com, navigate to the resources tab in the upper middle, as I said, and then from there to the digital library. There's a number of videos on risk-based testing that can give you a basic overview in a life cycle independent way of how risk-based testing works. So I'd encourage you to do that, and if this is entirely new to you. Just to give a high-level overview here of risk analysis and risk-based testing, something I can spend and do spend hours and hours on in training courses. Basically, what we can say is that risk is the possibility of a negative or undesirable outcome. Oh, it's a bad thing that could happen, and risks have different levels of risk. And the easiest way to think of that is to look at two distinct factors. One is the likelihood of this bad thing happening, and the other is the impact if this bad thing does happen. And I think this is fairly intuitive. We do this in our day-to-day life all the time. Sort of things that are at a certain threshold of likelihood and a certain threshold of impact, then we worry about them. And the higher the likelihood and or impact, the greater the steps that we take to avoid getting into into such a situation, a risky situation. So most people are aware that car accidents can be fairly high impact, but they're relatively low likelihood. So as long as we're cautious when we're driving, then that's the sufficient mitigation. Of course, you don't want to do anything that is going to increase your likelihood of being in a car accident, like driving drunk, or driving at a time of night or during a particular holiday when a lot of people are drunk, like for example driving around at 2 a.m. and on New Year's Eve. Probably not the world's smartest thing to do. So most of the time we take steps to reduce likelihood wherever we can for those things that are going to be a significant impact to us. So again, just pretty much common sense. Now, when I talk about quality risk, quality risk is a potential problem that could occur that would affect the quality of the product. And I'll give you some examples of that on the next slide. A project risk is different. A project risk is a potential problem that would endanger a project's success. Now, generally, the way that you can distinguish between a quality risk and a project risk is to ask yourself whether you could mitigate the risk by running a test prior to release. If you can, then it's quality risk. Quality risks are testable. I can test for performance problems, for example. But project risks, things like somebody being out sick for a substantial period of time, key piece of equipment not showing up on time, so forth, I can't run a test to mitigate that risk. Now, in a traditional lifecycle model, there is going to be one big quality risk analysis up front during the planning process, and the results of that risk analysis, the risk catalog, will be periodically adjusted as new information becomes available, typically at major project milestones. In Agile, that gets turned on its head. So what happens is that during the release planning at the very beginning, then say a tester and maybe just one or two of the developers together with the business stakeholders will sit down and do a very high level analysis of the risks, just again at a high level, very general, the kinds of things that we'd be worried about, just to gain some insights and to position ourselves to do certain kinds of testing that might have longer lead times, such as, say, performance testing or something like that. But the bulk of the risk analysis, the detailed quality risk analysis, is actually going to occur, as I said before, during iteration planning, and it will involve the whole team, including the product owner or other business stakeholders. And that's where we're going to identify the specific risks as opposed to the high-level risks. And then, of course, in that sprint, we'll address those specific risks through the design, implementation, and execution of tests. So let's look at some examples here of what we would be talking about if we were talking about a quality risk. Anything that would affect customer, user, or stakeholder satisfaction can be thought of as a quality risk, assuming that it is a testable attribute of the system. So, an example: system calculates incorrect total on a year-end sales report. That would be one example of a functional quality risk item. Slow response time during user login. That's a non-functional quality risk, specifically related to performance. User finds the customer login screen confusing. That's also a non-functional quality risk, in this case related to usability. And we can have functional and non-functional quality risks. It's important that you do consider both types. Now, what we're going to do in the risk analysis, we'll identify these specific risk items, and it's typically going to be, 15, 20, 25 risk items in a single sprint. It's very unlikely to be more than that. So we will do more testing for the higher level risks, do less testing for the lower level risks. Again, trying to sequence the development so that we can test the higher level risks earlier and the lower level risks later. And in terms of effort allocation, it's important that when we go through the estimation process that we assign more effort, story points or person hours, however you're doing that as part of your estimation process, to make sure that you're thinking about how much testing effort is involved as part of the release planning. Okay, so in terms of the process, at the beginning of each iteration, you're going to be going through the selected iteration backlog items. And as part of that process, together with the whole team, what we're going to do is identify the functional and non-functional quality risks that are associated with each one of the items. Then, once we have identified the quality risks, we want to go through, and categorize the risks appropriately. What type of risk is it? Usability, performance, reliability, and so forth. Just to think about, okay, what kind of testing is going to be required here? What test type will be necessary? And also, for each risk item, assess the level of risk based on the likelihood and impact. Now, as you do that process, you want to make sure that you avoid clumping of the risk ratings. Now, clumping happens when you have too many items that are receiving the same or similar likelihood and or impact rating. So, for example, if most of the risk items are rated as very high or high impact, then you have clumping. What you want is a fairly even distribution of the risk items across the impact ratings and across the likelihood ratings. And it's easy enough if you use a spreadsheet to look at this in a histogram and see if you have any clumping happening. You want to be careful of that, because if you do have a lot of clumping, then you're not going to get any real good effective prioritization of your tests out of the process. So once you have the likelihood and impact distributions looking good, and many times the pathway to doing that is simply making sure that you have very clear criteria for assignment into particular likelihood and impact ratings, especially with impact, and especially the higher ones. It's very high and high impact. You want to try to be very strict about what gets rated as very high or high impact. Once you have that all determined, then you're going to be able to use the level of risk to figure out what the appropriate extent of testing is. I'm going to come back to that topic here in a little bit. And that's subsequently going to also determine what test techniques you should use to cover each risk item, and that's something else I'm going to come back to. Now, that's something for you in terms of your design and implementation, the extent of testing to pursue, the test techniques to use. Now, there's also another group activity that needs to happen here, which is the estimation part, participating in the estimation. And you're going to use the selected extent of testing to influence how much effort you think is required to test a particular risk item to cover it adequately. So that'll be part of your input into the estimation process. Now, in traditional life cycle models, excuse me, I had to get a little drink of water there. In a traditional life cycle model, we have to plan on fairly significant updates to the risk catalog at major project milestones as the project evolves. Now, since we're doing the risk analysis on an iteration by iteration basis, we're much closer to the work. So the adjustments tend to be a lot less, but nonetheless, it is still possible that you will need to make adjustments as you go. So you should be aware of that possibility, ready for that possibility as you go along, that you might need to make adjustments. Now, something else to be aware of is that just as in a traditional lifecycle model, when you're going through a user story, and identifying risks in it, you might very well identify problems in the user story, testability issues, functionality problems, lack of clarity, and so forth. So it should be seen as an opportunity to improve the user stories as well as identifying risks in them. Okay. Now, in this slide, you see a template for capturing risks, and again, I would recommend using a spreadsheet to do this. Let me get over here with the highlighter. So we have a list of 24 quality risk categories. It's available for free download off of the basic library on the RBCS website. And what I would do is encourage you to go to get that list. And when you're going through the risk identification process during iteration planning, then after going through the user stories, make sure that you quickly review the risks in that checklist, or excuse me, the risk categories in that checklist to make sure that you haven't left anything out. It's quite possible that you could omit something. The thing with user stories is that in spite of I don't know, the ambitions of some people to capture non-functional elements in a user story, what we're seeing with our clients is that for the most part, the user stories are describing functional behavior. Now, in some cases, it's pretty straightforward to see non-functional risk items associated with a specific user story, but in other cases, it's not. So, it's evidence of this. I guess if I say inherent weakness in Agile, I'll get the dogmatist stirred up. But I do think that this is a risk that's inherent in the use of user stories as a way of capturing requirements. Because of that, the rollout of the healthcare.gov here in the United States was very problematic in terms of things like interoperability and performance and security, because they used Agile methods to develop that system, and the functionality was apparently there. What was behind it wasn't so good because it didn't communicate well with other things, and also it had significant performance and security problems. So just be careful when you're doing the risk analysis. Don't just confine yourself to the user stories. Make sure that you go through this checklist as well, and be careful not to forget any non-functional kinds of risks. So you go through, you identify the risks. That's the first pass. And then having done that, you're going to go back and assess the likelihood and the impact associated with each risk. Now, likelihood, this is the likelihood that a bug might exist in the software when it's delivered to you for testing. It's basically a measure of the level of technical risk, because likelihood is, it has to do with how the system is built. Impact is, how bad would it be if we released something with a bug in this area and it affected our customers, users, or other stakeholders. So that's primarily from a business perspective, that rating. Some of our clients actually, they delegate the rating of likelihood to their most senior developer and delegate the rating of impact to product owner. We have one client that's doing Agile risk-based testing, and that's the approach that they're using. So that is something you can do, or you can just have it be part of this group activity. I think in Agile, probably makes more sense to have it be part of this group activity as long as you can, as long as you're careful to manage the time that's associated with doing it. Now, as you can see, I have a suggested scale here from very high to very low. I'm using a descending scale, which is as the number goes down, or as the number goes up, the risk goes down. Likelihood and impact, that is, as well as the aggregate measure of risk. If you don't like that, if you prefer to use an ascending scale where the higher number, 5, means the highest level of likelihood and or impact, then feel free to do that. Just, you can do it either way. I use the descending scale just because it's very similar to typical bug tracking systems, that severity 1 is the most important bug and severity 5 is least important bugs. But use whichever approach, ascending or descending, that you like. Now, what is very important is that you have, as I said before, clearly defined criteria that have to be satisfied for a risk item to fit into a particular likelihood and impact rating. It's especially important for impact. Likelihood is a little more straightforward because something that's very high likelihood, is clearly something that's almost certain to happen, right? Versus high likelihood, where it's like, well, it's more likely to happen than not to happen. Medium likelihood is, well, it might happen, it might not happen. It's about 50-50. Low likelihood is, it's more likely not to happen than to happen. And very low likelihood is it's almost certain not to happen. That's pretty straightforward. People internalize that pretty quickly. But impact is a little harder. And I've done exercises with people around the world on this, and worked with clients around the world on this, and everybody always struggles with, how do I assign impact? And the key to it is come up with a set of criteria that are clearly defined, that everybody can understand, that are, fairly simple. You want this not to be too convoluted, and, not trying to replicate the U.S. tax code or anything like that with this. So you want to keep it down to 3, maybe 4 criteria per level, and then people just look at it and go, yeah, okay, it meets that one, so it goes in here. If you can get these criteria right, the impact ratings will be pretty straightforward. If you don't get the criteria right, this is going to be a constant source of struggle, and worse yet, you're not going to achieve the kind of benefits out of this technique that you really want. Now, having rated the likelihood and the impact, we can then come up with the risk priority number, which is the way I do this is I like to keep things simple. I just multiply the likelihood times the impact. So if I have a likelihood of 1 and an impact of 1, the risk priority number is 1. Likelihood of 3 and an impact of 2, then the risk priority number is 6, and so forth. Obviously, if I set this up in a spreadsheet, this can all be happening completely automatically. Then next, I select the extent of testing. Now, what I've shown here is that if the risk priority number is from 1 to 5, I'm going to do extensive testing. If it's from 6 to 10, I'm going to do broad testing. 11 to 15 will be cursory testing. 16 to 20 will be opportunistic testing, and 21 to 25 will be no testing, but I will report bugs. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the extensive testing and what those mean here in a moment. So hold your thoughts and questions on that. I'll explain this further. The important thing to keep in mind about these extensive testing categories here, the five levels that I've shown, is that this still leaves a lot to the judgment of the tester. It's not like a magic formula that you're going to be able to crank out, so this risk priority number equals this number of person hours, or this, this number of test cases. That's not something you're going to be able to do. I don't think it would make a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, if you had developed a bunch of tests for a bunch of risk items, and you did a scatter plot, looking at the number of tests per risk item based on the risk priority number of the risk item, clearly you would see correlation there, but I don't think it would be like a nice straight line, showing perfect correlation. I don't think it makes sense to do that. It's more of a matter of guidance. And then finally, this tracing column here, you would just capture the user story identifier. That way, if the user story is modified at some point during the course of the sprint, new acceptance criteria are defined for it, what have you, you can go back and look at the risks that are related to it and see if any of those risks need to be expanded upon. Okay, so as a template for capturing it, so you're going to estimate, as I said, as part of iteration planning. So the risk level is one of the things you're going to look at when you're trying to think of what's the story size from a testing point of view. And you also want to think about complexity. Some things are just inherently harder to test because they're more complex. There's also uncertainty that needs to be considered because if you're not clear on how you're going to test something, obviously you want to rate that as higher. In techniques like planning poker, you'll sometimes hear this phrase "throwing the king" to mean that this is sufficiently complex, uncertain, et cetera, that I can't estimate it. It's too big to estimate. It needs to be broken down further. Your risk analysis would then be a feed into the estimation process. Again, you use a technique like planning poker. That will work fine. You're going to need to be ready to explain, okay, this kind of risk item at this level of risk, this is how we have to go about testing it, so this is why it's going to take as long as I think it's going to take. Expect that you can get some amount of pushback if you say that something is going to take a lot of effort. Now, it is important that estimation be done in a reliable fashion. One of the things that you want to have in Agile is a well-established velocity for the team. In other words, how much work can the team get done in a given sprint, so that you're not like continually overcommitting and basically failing to deliver things. And that's because that's back to the bad old days of what people always complain about with the V model and then the sequential model is that, it's always, 20 pounds in a 10-pound bucket, and you get to the end of the project and it's not done, So you certainly don't want to replicate that in Agile, which means that you have to know, how much work can we get done in a 2-week, 3-week, 4-week sprint, what actually does constitute a particular size of work. So, yeah, it's important that this be done, carefully and seriously. Now let's look at the different extents of testing here, extent of testing ratings or levels, from extensive to broad to cursory to opportunity to report bugs only. Basically, if extensive, it is what it sounds like. You're going to run a lot of tests. You're going to test broad across the breadth of the user story, as well as deep. You're going to do combinational types of testing. You're going to go out and you're going to look at relevant techniques and apply them with very strong coverage criteria. Now, if you haven't seen this already, and I would guess that most of you haven't, there is a article on the RBCS articles page. So if you go out to the articles page, you can find this. Pretty short. It's like three pages. It's actually it's a former blog post converted into an article, which in turn is part of a book that I wrote, Advanced Software Testing Volume 2. Volume 2. And that will give you guidance on suggested techniques to match up with these particular extensive testing. So I'd suggest that you go out and look at that. I'm just covering this kind of at a higher level here on this slide, but there's a lot more depth about what I mean by use all relevant techniques with strong coverage criteria, for example. So broad testing is, I'm not going to run a lot of tests. It's going to be kind of a medium level of tests. I'm going to make sure that I've identified a lot of different interesting conditions. I'm going to apply the relevant test design techniques, but I'm not going to be very strict about coverage. Cursory is, I'm just going to test the most interesting things. I'm going to use various test design techniques, but, I'm going to be pretty relaxed about what it would mean to cover them. Opportunity is, I'm not going to create any tests specifically for this risk item, but I am, if I get a chance to test this as part of testing something else, I will do that. Exploratory testing, for example, is a good fit for this. And then report bugs only is, I'm going to say, I'm not actually going to do any testing for this at all, but if I happen to see a bug related to this risk item, I will spend the time to report it. Now, the relative distributions of these, I showed on the previous slide, even distribution. I mean, 1 through 5 was extensive, and 6 through 10 was broad, and so forth. You don't have to do it that way. You can make those distributions however you want, whatever is going to fit for your product. If you're dealing with something that's much more, and quality is very important, you might have, you might only have extensive, broad, and cursory as the 3 levels of risk that you use. And every risk item is going to get tested. It's just a matter of to what extent. If something's seen as generally low risk and it's like, well, look, we just need to get a lot of features out as quickly as possible, there may be very little extensive testing, maybe even fairly limited amount of broad testing, and mostly cursory and opportunity testing with some amount of reporting bugs only. So, it's completely up to you as to how to kind of tweak that distribution to fit what you want. Now, in terms of that template that we were looking at, I mentioned that this spreadsheet is a good way of doing that. There are, out on the RBCS basic library, a couple examples of spreadsheets used for risk analysis. So, feel free to download those and use those as well. Okay, so again, this risk identification needs to be part of this whole collaborative process of user story creation. So when we're doing the risk identification, we're looking at the user stories. It may very well be modifying them, clarifying them, defining acceptance criteria for those. So this process of identification of the risk item should be integrated into that process of creating and refining the user stories for a particular iteration. Particularly important is to talk about the confirmation process of how you're going to check the acceptance criteria during this risk analysis process that you're going through. Obviously to make it clear what it would mean for this to be done is essential to really uncovering all of the risks that you're going to need to explore as part of doing the testing. And it's also important that you deal with any sort of testability issues that are associated with a particular user story. So a testability issue, an example of that would be, there might be a couple different ways to implement a user story, and one of them inherently creates a whole lot more potential invalid inputs that would have to be tested. As an example of that, suppose that you were testing something like Microsoft Outlook, and specifically looking at the task and appointment creation. Now, if you're familiar with that feature, not only can you select dates and times off of pull-down menus, but you can also edit them directly. Now, that means that you have to test both different ways of entering a date, and there's a whole lot of negative testing that has to be done for the manual entry that is completely unnecessary for the pull-down list. If you can't, if a date doesn't exist, like the 31st of February, it's not going to be on the pull-down calendar, and thus you can't select it. So, that makes an Outlook inherently less testable than, say, the GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar interface that we use for this particular presentation. When I was setting up some webinars for the spring yesterday, I went to enter dates and times. You can't edit those directly. Those are selected off of a pull down menu, which is a calendar, and the only things that you see are valid dates. So the Citrix interface is inherently, the Citrix GoToWebinar interface is inherently a lot more testable, and then it's easier to test than the Microsoft Outlook interface. So, have that conversation, because that's important too from a how much risk mitigation can we actually accomplish perspective. Okay. So again, look at the acceptance criteria, look at the risks that are associated with particular acceptance criteria. See here it says, okay, current and previous versions of four different browsers. No horizontal scrolling required. So, it's pretty clear there. You go, okay, well, I've got specific tests that I have to do. There's basically eight supported browsers. There's four different specific browsers, but two versions of each one. And I also have to make sure that I look at the horizontal scrolling. If there's anything that's unclear in terms of the acceptance criteria and the quality risks that would be associated with that, then again, you just need to go, okay, we need to talk about this a little further. Now, in a lot of our clients that are doing Agile, following a model that looks like what you see here on this slide, which is that, let me get the spotlight up. You have testers, individual testers, who are assigned to work as part of a specific Scrum team, and so they're embedded within the team. And you have other testers who are doing supporting roles like automation and test data and test environments and so forth, and are not specifically within the team. And we have a test manager managing this whole group. Now, this can be kind of a transition role-wise, because in traditional lifecycle models, the risk analysis and the test planning is going to be driven by the test manager. If there's a tester, an individual contributor involved in the risk analysis, it's going to be a very senior one. Now, each individual tester here is going to have to be ready to drive the risk analysis, quality risk analysis within their own teams, possibly supported by the test manager, but for the most part on their own. So this is important. If you are a test manager, you're transitioning into Agile, you're currently using risk-based testing, you want to make sure that you continue to do that. If you've been traditionally the one who's been handling the quality risk analysis, you're going to need to ramp up your people. You're going to need to get them up to speed on how this process works. So, probably the way to do that is to support them initially by being present during that process for each person and coaching them getting them some training, either actual formal training, or making sure they go through some of the resources that are available on the RBCS website, for example, at the very least, so that they can actually do this, carry this out. Because otherwise, what's likely to happen is that they're just simply not going to know how to do it, and the process is going to wither and die. Now, change does happen. This is part of this sort of an essential aspect of agile development, and so when things change, keep in mind that will affect your risk analysis. That will affect your current test results. Be ready to go back and look at your risk analysis, update your risk analysis if there is a change to a user story, or if there's a new user story that gets dropped in the middle of a sprint. I know that according to Scrum theory, these things aren't supposed to happen, that once the content of a sprint is decided, that should not change. But, for pretty much every client that I've worked with that's doing Agile, change does happen during the sprints, and you have to be ready to deal with it, and make sure that you're set up to report your results in a way which is flexible enough that it's, when the change happens, it's not a big disaster to you in terms of your results reporting. This is one of the challenges that our clients that are trying to use the more traditional type of test management tools like Rational Test Manager or Quality Center, those kind of things, are running into when they try to transition to Agile, is that they find out, it's the tools were sort of designed on a basic assumption that plans would be established at the beginning, the test basis would be established at the beginning of the project, and that's that, and so, if you are using one of the more traditional test management tools for results capture and results reporting, just, think through this issue of how do we set this up and how do we capture information in a way that's change resistant. Make sure that part of your results reporting does include capturing the status of the risk items. One of the things that you might do is figure out a way of taking that risk catalog that we put together at the beginning of the iteration and categorizing each risk item as your tests go, as your test execution goes. Basically, what I would suggest is that each risk item should be categorized as green, red, or black. Green means that for this risk item, all of the associated tests have been run and they all pass, so this risk is fully mitigated. Red would mean some or all of the tests for this risk item have been run, and at least one of those tests is currently failing, or there was a bug found that is associated with this risk item via something like exploratory testing. So this is a risk with known problems. And then black is basically a risk that is neither red nor green. So some or none of the tests have been run. At this point, none of the tests have failed, and there are no known bugs, but we're still in the dark about this, hence black classification. We haven't finished testing it yet. So, there are ways of making that pretty easily visible. You could have just a simple whiteboard that had 3 columns, that had black, red, and green, and the risk items are stuck up there in the appropriate column, and you're not done until all of the risk items are in the green column. And this is something that could be done as a way of augmenting the task boards in the daily stand-up meetings. Basically, that's going to provide a little additional detail underneath the testing status. So if we look at the task board here, example task board, as things as user stories, the US there, as those move into the verify column, we're going to find bugs with them. There might be associated tasks that get spawned out of that. So let me get the highlighter up here. The test results here would be where you would actually have a finer grain breakdown for the status of these different verifies. Like, again, the user stories, what is the user story? Can also be classified as red, green, red, or black, using the same kind of criteria I was just discussing. The risks, bugs can be shown as, whether they're active or not. So having a separate way of displaying your test results is a good practice in Agile, because the problem with these task boards is that they're really pretty opaque when it comes to what the status of testing is. And if you look at the agenda, again, in Agile here, your agenda for the daily stand-up meetings is just, what have you done since the last meeting? What do you plan to complete by the next one? What's getting in your way? That's purely tactical in terms of how do we get to done, right? But you actually also want to discuss as a tester, well, what's the status of my testing? So you need an additional item on your agenda that basically says, what's the test status? So want to incorporate that here so that you're able to provide some detail in terms of the test results. Okay, so conclude here. Risk-based testing is a long-proven testing best practice. This is something that I've been working on, helping clients do, and using myself for, closing in on 20 years now. When I first got started doing it, it was kind of outlandish, I guess, and we were using techniques that were pretty heavyweight, borrowed from manufacturing. Just like, a lot of people are trying to do with Agile now, borrowing lean ideas. We borrowed things like failure mode and effect analysis. But we've really gotten it tightened up a lot now, and it's, nice, lightweight, but effective techniques. There are a number of things that are important about risk-based testing, and the two that are most important, one is engagement of the stakeholders, which fortunately in Agile, you're supposed to have that in the stakeholder engagement. Another thing that's very important is properly integrating the risk-based testing activities into the life cycle. And that is something that a lot of our clients have struggled with. Hopefully this is giving you some ideas on how to do that. Keep in mind that, as I've mentioned throughout here, that the quality risk analysis iterates. It happens at the beginning of each iteration. It is adjusted during the iterations. You want to make sure that you don't just use this to think out how much testing to do, but also, again, the design, the execution, and the results reporting should all be risk aware. It is possible, as I've discussed, to integrate this into other traditional or other particular Agile techniques, planning poker, for example, and the use of this in estimation, augmenting the task board to have an additional test results board. Risk-based testing implemented properly is very consistent with the whole Agile approach. It is going to get your focus in the right place, and ultimately make your testing more agile in a way that complements the